The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Rosemary Cottage's drawing room, casting dancing patterns across the Persian carpet, where the ladies of St. Mary Mead had gathered for what Mrs. Dolly Bantry cheerfully termed a proper civilized tea. The occasion was ostensibly to welcome Mrs. Helena Ashworth to the village. She had recently inherited Greenvale Manor from a distant cousin, but as with most social gatherings in St. Mary Mead, the real purpose was the delicious exchange of news, observations, and the sort of gentle speculation that keeps village life interesting. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary corner chair, her knitting needles moving in their familiar, soothing rhythm as she worked on a delicate lace pattern. Her pale blue eyes, however, were far from idle, taking in the subtle currents of conversation and the small, telling gestures that revealed so much about human nature. At her age, she had learned that the most fascinating dramas often played out not in grand theatres, but in drawing rooms just like this one, where people gathered with their careful masks of respectability firmly in place. The centerpiece of both the room and the afternoon's conversation was an extraordinary antique mirror that Mrs. Ashworth had brought with her from London. It dominated the wall behind the mahogany sideboard, nearly 6 feet of silvered glass, set in an ornate frame of what appeared to be 18th century craftsmanship. The mirror seemed to capture and reflect not just the assembled ladies, but the very essence of the room itself. The warm light, the delicate china, the carefully arranged flowers that spoke of generations of feminine refinement. "It's been in my family for over 2 centuries," Mrs. Ashworth was explaining to the assembled company, her voice carrying that particular note of satisfaction that comes from possessing something genuinely remarkable. She was an elegant woman in her 50s, with silver hair arranged in a style that suggested both sophistication and a certain inflexibility of character. The dealer who authenticated it believes it once belonged to Lady Pembroke herself. Imagine the faces it must have reflected, the secrets it must have witnessed. Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment as she observed the way Mrs. Ashworth positioned herself near the mirror, as if she were somehow completing the composition it created. There was something almost possessive in her manner, a quality that suggested the mirror was more than mere decoration to her. "How perfectly fascinating," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley, though her tone suggested she found it rather less fascinating than she claimed. "I do hope you've had it properly secured. Such valuable pieces can be terribly attractive to the wrong sort of people." The comment created a small ripple of unease around the room. Mrs. Ashworth's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, and Miss Marple noted that several of the other ladies exchanged glances that seemed to carry more significance than mere social awkwardness would account for. Dr. Haydock's wife, usually the most forthright of women, was fidgeting with her teacup in an uncharacteristic display of nervousness. Her eyes kept moving between the mirror and Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, as if she were waiting for some signal or perhaps dreading one. Young Mrs. Morrison, recently married to the village solicitor and still finding her place in the intricate social hierarchy of St. Mary Mead, sat perched on the edge of her chair, with a kind of brittle composure that often masked deeper anxieties. She had been staring at the mirror with an intensity that seemed quite out of proportion to its admittedly impressive appearance. "Mirrors do hold such fascinating histories," Miss Marple observed mildly, her fingers resuming their steady work. "I've always thought they must see so much more than we realize. All those reflections, all those moments captured and released again. Rather like memory, in a way, sometimes showing us things we'd prefer to forget." Mrs. Clement, normally the most serene of women, started slightly at these words, her hand trembling as she set down her teacup. The small sound of china against china seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the room. "Are you quite all right, my dear?" asked Mrs. Bantry with genuine concern. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." Mrs. Clement managed a weak smile, but Miss Marple noticed that her gaze was fixed on the mirror with an expression of something very like recognition and fear. "Perhaps I have," she said quietly. "Perhaps we all carry our ghosts with us, and sometimes they choose the most inconvenient moments to make themselves known." The cryptic remark hung in the air like incense, heavy with unspoken meaning. Miss Marple found herself studying the faces reflected in the magnificent mirror, noting how the silvered glass seemed to reveal not just physical appearances, but something deeper, the careful masks that people wore, and occasionally what lay beneath them. Mrs. Ashworth had gone quite pale, her earlier pride in her acquisition replaced by something that looked suspiciously like apprehension. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Oh, I think you do," Mrs. Clement replied, rising abruptly from her chair. Her usual gentle demeanor had been replaced by something harder, more determined. "I think we all do. The question is whether we're prepared to face what we see when we look closely enough." She moved toward the mirror as if drawn by some invisible force, stopping just inches from its surface. For a long moment she stood perfectly still, staring at her own reflection with an expression of profound distress. Then, quite suddenly, she raised her hand and pressed her palm flat against the glass. "Some reflections," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "should never be allowed to surface." What happened next would be debated by the ladies of St. Mary Mead for years to come. Some claimed they heard a sound like a sigh, others insisted it was more like a crack. What everyone agreed upon was that Mrs. Clement suddenly staggered backward, her face white as parchment, one hand pressed to her throat as if she couldn't breathe. The mirror itself seemed to shiver in its frame, the afternoon light playing across its surface in patterns that made no earthly sense. For one impossible moment, Miss Marple could have sworn she saw not the reflection of the drawing-room, but something else entirely, a different room, a different time, faces that belonged to no one present. Then Mrs. Clement collapsed, her knitting bag spilling its contents across the Persian carpet, and the mirror showed nothing but the chaos of frightened women rushing to help, their careful afternoon shattered as completely as if the glass itself had fallen from its frame. Miss Marple remained in her chair for a moment longer than the others, her experienced eyes taking in details that would prove significant later. The way Mrs. Ashworth had instinctively stepped away from rather than toward the fallen woman. The small, satisfied smile that flickered across Mrs. Price Ridley's face before she composed herself. And most tellingly, the fact that Mrs. Clement's hand, when it fell away from her throat, revealed the faint but unmistakable marks of old bruising, as if someone had gripped her there not once, but many times. As Dr. Haydock was summoned and the drawing-room filled with the controlled panic of a social emergency, Miss Marple continued to watch the mirror. It had returned to its normal function now, reflecting only what was actually there, but she had the distinct impression that it had shown them something true. Perhaps more true than any of them were prepared to acknowledge. The perfect afternoon had ended, but Miss Marple suspected that the real drama was only just beginning. The evening that followed Mrs. Clement's collapse settled over St. Mary Mead with deceptive tranquility, but beneath the surface, the village hummed with an energy that had nothing to do with the approaching dusk. News of the incident at Rosemary Cottage spread with the swift efficiency that only village gossip can achieve, carried along telephone wires and over garden fences with the kind of breathless urgency usually reserved for matters of life and death, which Miss Marple reflected as she observed the flurry of activity from her sitting-room window. This might very well prove to be. Dr. Haydock had pronounced Mrs. Clement's condition stable but concerning, recommending complete rest and no visitors for at least 24 hours. The diagnosis of severe nervous shock satisfied no one, least of all those who had witnessed the profound terror in Mrs. Clement's eyes just before she collapsed. By the time the church bells chimed 8 o'clock, every household in St. Mary Mead had heard some version of the story, though the details varied considerably, depending on who was doing the telling and what their particular temperament led them to emphasize. The village theories take shape, Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to let a dramatic opportunity pass unexploited, had quickly established herself as the authority on supernatural explanations. "Ancient mirrors," she proclaimed to anyone within earshot at the post office, "are notorious for harboring malevolent influences. I've read extensively on the subject." The fact that her reading consisted primarily of sensational novels did nothing to diminish her confidence. "Mark my words, that mirror has witnessed terrible events, and poor Mrs. Clement, being of a sensitive nature, was simply overwhelmed by the psychic emanations." Mrs. Bantry, ever practical, favored a more medical interpretation when she telephoned Miss Marple that evening. "The poor dear was clearly suffering from the heat and excitement," she insisted, though her voice carried less conviction than her words suggested. All those people crowded into that drawing room, and Mrs. Ashworth's rather theatrical presentation of her acquisition. Some people are simply more susceptible to overstimulation. Young Mrs. Morrison had developed an entirely different theory, one that she shared with increasing agitation as the evening progressed. She blamed Mrs. Ashworth herself, convinced that the newcomer had deliberately created an atmosphere of tension. There was something almost calculated about the way she positioned that mirror, Mrs. Morrison confided to her husband over dinner, as if she wanted to provoke a reaction, and poor Mrs. Clement, always so composed, was clearly disturbed by something she saw. Miss Marple listened to these various theories with her customary patience, noting how each person's interpretation seemed to reveal more about their own character than about the actual events. Mrs. Price Ridley's craving for drama, Mrs. Bantry's desire for rational explanations, Mrs. Morrison's underlying insecurity about social dynamics, all were laid bare in their attempts to make sense of what they had witnessed. A series of revealing visits. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple found herself the recipient of several unexpected visitors, each seeking her perspective on the afternoon's events, while simultaneously revealing their own concerns and observations. Mrs. Ashworth arrived first, ostensibly to inquire about Mrs. Clement's condition, but actually, Miss Marple suspected, to gauge how much the other ladies might have understood about what had transpired. She settled herself in Miss Marple's sitting room with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed her approach. "I feel terribly responsible," Mrs. Ashworth began, though her tone suggested she felt nothing of the sort. Poor Mrs. Clement seemed so distressed by the mirror. "I do hope the other ladies won't think I deliberately brought something unsettling into the village." Miss Marple continued her knitting, noting the way Mrs. Ashworth's fingers drummed nervously against her teacup. "Objects sometimes carry associations we don't expect," she replied mildly. Though I must say, Mrs. Clement's reaction seemed quite specific, almost as if she recognized something. The comment clearly unsettled Mrs. Ashworth, who left shortly afterward with promises to send flowers to the vicarage as soon as Dr. Haydock permitted visitors. More illuminating was the visit from Mrs. Haydock, who arrived just as the evening light was fading and seemed genuinely distraught about her friend's condition. She revealed that Mrs. Clement was a relatively recent arrival to St. Mary Mead, having moved there only 3 years ago after her husband's death. "She's always been the most composed person I know," Mrs. Haydock confided, accepting Miss Marple's offer of sherry with obvious gratitude. "Even during her husband's final illness, she maintained such dignity. To see her react so violently to that mirror, it was as though she saw something terrible in the glass." But it was young Mrs. Morrison's visit that proved most intriguing. She arrived just after dark, in a state of considerable agitation, declining tea and pacing nervously around Miss Marple's sitting room before finally bursting out with a confession that she couldn't stop thinking about the mirror. There was something wrong about it, she insisted, her hands twisting in her lap. "I know it sounds foolish, but while I was looking into it during the tea party, I could swear I saw a different room entirely. Darker wallpaper, furniture that didn't match Mrs. Ashworth's decor. And Miss Marple," she paused, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I saw a man standing behind us, a man who cast no reflection of his own." Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. "How very interesting," she said quietly. "And you think Mrs. Clement saw him too?" "I'm certain of it," Mrs. Morrison replied. "The way she looked at the mirror, the terror in her eyes. She recognized him, Miss Marple. I'm sure of it." New developments. The most significant news came via Mrs. Bantry's telephone call later that evening. "Helena Ashworth has summoned that London dealer," she reported with barely contained excitement. "Lionel Greeley, the man who authenticated the mirror. He's arriving on tomorrow afternoon's train. And Jane, there's something else. Do you remember Ezra Pike, that restoration expert who was here 2 months ago, working on the long gallery at Greenvale Manor? He's told several people that the mirror's frame has been altered. He used some technical term, palimpsestic, I think. It means the frame has been changed to conceal something." Miss Marple absorbed this information with interest. A dealer arriving unexpectedly, a frame that had been deliberately altered to hide something, a widow who had fled to St. Mary Mead after her husband's death, and now visions of a man who cast no reflection. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly out of reach. Miss Marple's reflections. As she prepared for bed that evening, Miss Marple found herself thinking about mirrors and the curious way they could serve as windows into both the past and the hidden recesses of human nature. In her experience, people often revealed their truest selves when they thought they were unobserved, and mirrors had a way of catching those unguarded moments, or in this case, perhaps reflecting memories that someone had spent years trying to forget. The detail that continued to trouble her most was those faint bruises on Mrs. Clement's throat. In all the village's eager theorizing about supernatural influences and nervous exhaustion, no one else seemed to have noticed them, or if they had, they were choosing not to mention them. But Miss Marple had seen such marks before, and she knew they spoke of a very earthly kind of violence, the sort that left scars on both body and soul. Tomorrow, she decided, assuming Dr. Haydock permitted it, she would pay a visit to Mrs. Clement. There were questions that needed answering, and she suspected that the elegant mirror at Rosemary Cottage had reflected far more truth than anyone was comfortable acknowledging. The village might be buzzing with theories about curses and vapors, but Miss Marple's instincts told her that the real explanation lay somewhere in the intersection of human secrets, guilty consciences, and the uncomfortable clarity that sometimes comes from seeing one's past reflected with perfect, unforgiving accuracy. The mirror, it seemed, had indeed stopped reflecting the present and begun showing something far more dangerous. The truth about what had happened long before it ever arrived in St. Mary Mead. The morning light fell across St. Mary Mead with deceptive gentleness, touching the cottage gardens and slate roofs as if nothing more dramatic than a tea party had occurred the day before. Yet beneath this pastoral tranquility, the village hummed with an undercurrent of speculation that no amount of ordinary sunshine could dispel. Miss Marple, having tended her roses and selected a small bouquet for cheer, made her way toward the vicarage with the measured pace of someone whose mind was occupied with far more than floral arrangements. Miss Marple's careful investigation. Dr. Haydock intercepted her near the vicarage gate, his professional manner softened by long acquaintance. "Nervous shock?" he said before she could ask, anticipating the village's collective curiosity. "Pulse much improved this morning, but she's still quite shaken. No visitors, I'm afraid, except—" He paused, studying Miss Marple's innocent expression with the wariness of a man who had learned to read between the lines of her charitable visits. "2 minutes, Jane. Nothing about mirrors." "Of course not," Miss Marple replied with perfect sincerity. "I thought perhaps we might discuss the late roses. They've been quite extraordinary this year." Inside the vicarage, Mrs. Clement received her in the small morning room that overlooked the garden, a space that seemed to embody the quiet dignity that had always characterized the widow. She appeared composed but fragile, like fine porcelain that had survived a fall but retained hairline cracks, visible only to the careful observer. Miss Marple noted immediately that a silk scarf had been arranged to partially conceal her throat, though the faint discoloration remained visible to anyone who knew what to look for. "How kind of you to come," Mrs. Clements said, her voice carrying the particular strain of someone working to maintain normalcy. "I'm afraid I made quite a spectacle of myself yesterday. The other ladies must think me terribly overwrought." Miss Marple settled into her chair with the practiced ease of countless similar visits, her knitting emerging from her bag as naturally as breathing. "My dear, anyone who has lived as long as I have learns that there are moments when the past refuses to remain properly buried, no matter how carefully we've covered it over. Sometimes a simple reflection can bring back memories we thought we'd successfully forgotten." The words hung in the air between them, and Miss Marple observed the way Mrs. Clements' carefully maintained composure flickered like candlelight in a draught. Her hands, folded in her lap with deliberate precision, betrayed the slightest tremor. They spoke, as promised, of roses and the peculiarities of the season, but Miss Marple's experienced eye catalogued details that would prove significant. The way Mrs. Clements' fingers occasionally moved to her throat in an unconscious, protective gesture. The carefully controlled breathing of someone managing pain. And most tellingly, the small, silver-backed hand mirror on the side table turned deliberately face down. "Mirrors can be such capricious things," Miss Marple observed mildly, her needles moving in their soothing rhythm. "The way they catch the light, the shadows they create. Even the steadiest heart might be startled by an unexpected reflection." Mrs. Clements' response was barely audible. It wasn't unexpected. That was the problem. The village theories multiply. The arrival of the London train that afternoon brought with it Mr. Lionel Greeley, the antique dealer whose authentication had originally established the mirror's provenance. Miss Marple, who happened to be collecting her pension from the post office, observed his meeting with Mrs. Ashworth from a discreet distance. He was a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit, carrying himself with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to evaluating valuable objects, and perhaps people as well. The interaction between dealer and client struck Miss Marple as oddly formal, lacking the warmth one might expect between business associates. More significantly, she noticed the way Greeley's gaze seemed to assess Mrs. Ashworth with the same calculating attention he might give to a questionable antique, as if determining her authenticity or condition. By tea time, the village had generated a fresh crop of theories. Mrs. Price Ridley, having consulted her collection of spiritualist literature, now proclaimed the mirror a genuine haunted artifact requiring immediate exorcism. Mrs. Bantry favored a more practical explanation involving nervous exhaustion and the unfortunate tendency of sensitive people to dramatize minor incidents. Young Mrs. Morrison, however, had developed a theory that proved most intriguing to Miss Marple. "There was something wrong about the reflection itself," she confided during an impromptu visit. "I know it sounds mad, but while I was looking into it, I could swear I saw a different room entirely, darker wallpaper, different furniture. And Miss Marple, I saw a man standing behind us who cast no reflection of his own." New developments and revelations. The most significant intelligence came via Mrs. Bantry's telephone call just as the evening light was fading. "Helena has had the mirror moved to the long gallery at Greenvale," she reported with barely contained excitement. "New fixings, stronger mounting. Apparently the frame has been extensively modified over the years. And Jane, there's something else. Miss Pierce at the post office mentioned that Helena sent a registered letter to an insurance company yesterday, then received a telegram confirming coverage effective at noon today. Rather convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" Miss Marple absorbed this information with interest. The pattern was becoming clearer. A valuable mirror with an altered frame, a newcomer with convenient insurance arrangements, and a widow with old injuries who had fled to St. Mary Mead after her husband's death. The pieces suggested a story far more complex than village gossip had yet imagined. The confrontation begins. When Mrs. Ashworth appeared unexpectedly at the vicarage later that evening, Miss Marple happened to be making a second, briefer visit to check on Mrs. Clement's condition. The timing seemed less than coincidental. "I wanted to apologize personally," Mrs. Ashworth said, though her manner suggested she felt no genuine remorse. "I had no idea the mirror would provoke such a reaction." There was something in her tone that struck Miss Marple as distinctly calculated, a quality of performance that suggested Mrs. Ashworth knew far more about the source of Mrs. Clement's distress than she was admitting. The way she positioned herself in the room, claiming the chair with the best view of both women, reminded Miss Marple uncomfortably of a predator assessing its prey. Mrs. Clement, who had been gradually recovering her composure throughout the day, suddenly went very still, her gaze fixed on Mrs. Ashworth with an intensity that spoke of dawning recognition rather than mere social awkwardness. "You knew," she said quietly, her voice carrying a strength that had been absent since the previous afternoon. "Somehow, you knew exactly what that mirror would do to me." The accusation hung in the room like incense, heavy with implication and the promise of revelations yet to come. Mrs. Ashworth's carefully maintained mask of concern flickered for just a moment, and Miss Marple caught a glimpse of something calculating and cold beneath the surface. Courtesy. "I'm sure I don't understand," Mrs. Ashworth replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "How could I possibly know about your personal reactions to antique mirrors?" Miss Marple's growing suspicions. As the evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the curious intersection of coincidences that had brought these particular women together in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Clement, a widow who had fled her past, Mrs. Ashworth, a newcomer with a mysteriously significant mirror, and young Mrs. Morrison, whose hallucinations might prove to be the most accurate testimony of all. The bruising on Mrs. Clement's throat told its own story. Not recent violence, but the ghosts of it, the kind of systematic abuse that left marks on both body and soul. The mirror hadn't shown her a supernatural apparition. It had triggered memories so traumatic that her mind had projected her tormentor's image onto the glass with terrifying clarity. But the most troubling question remained. How had Mrs. Ashworth known to position the mirror exactly where it would have maximum impact on Mrs. Clement? The timing, the placement, the theatrical presentation, it all suggested a deliberate orchestration that went far beyond mere coincidence. As Miss Marple prepared for bed that evening, she reflected on the curious way that mirrors could serve as windows into both the past and the hidden recesses of human nature. In her experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood human psychology well enough to use it as a weapon. The mirror at Greenvale Manor had indeed reflected something true, but whether it was revealing secrets or creating them remained to be determined. The real investigation, she realized, was only just beginning. Tomorrow would bring Mr. Greeley's expert examination of the mirror, and with it, perhaps, the first concrete answers to questions that had been hidden behind layers of careful deception and willful blindness. The village might prefer its mysteries supernatural and its villains safely fictional, but Miss Marple suspected they were about to discover that the most frightening monsters were entirely human, and much closer to home than anyone wanted to believe. The morning brought with it an unseasonable chill that seemed to settle over St. Mary Mead like a premonition, though whether of revelation or catastrophe remained to be seen. Miss Marple, having completed her customary review of the Morning Post and observed the village's altered rhythm from her sitting-room window, noted that the usual patterns of daily life had acquired a distinctly expectant quality. People lingered longer at their garden gates. Conversations carried on with unusual intensity, and there was a general sense that everyone was waiting for something significant to unfold. The expert's examination. Mr. Lionel Greeley's arrival at Greenvale Manor shortly after 10 o'clock drew the kind of attention usually reserved for visiting dignitaries or traveling theatrical companies. His motor car, a gleaming testament to London prosperity, seemed almost incongruous against the pastoral backdrop of the Manor's ancient stone facade. Miss Marple, who had found it necessary to take a constitutional walk past the Manor gates at precisely the right moment, observed the proceedings with her characteristic blend of innocent curiosity and sharp attention to detail. The examination took place in the long gallery, where the mirror had been rehung with considerable ceremony and reinforced mounting. Greeley, accompanied by Ezra Pike and moving with the practiced grace of a man accustomed to handling valuable objects, began his methodical assessment. His white-gloved hands moved across the ornate frame with surgical precision, occasionally requesting specific tools or angles of light to better examine particular details. "The frame is undoubtedly magnificent 18th-century craftsmanship," Greeley announced after nearly an hour of careful inspection, his voice carrying the authority of professional expertise. However, as Mr. Pike correctly identified, there have been significant alterations. The original backing has been replaced entirely, portions of the frame have been re-gilded, and the glass itself, while period-appropriate, has been re-silvered at some point in its history. Mrs. Ashworth listened with carefully controlled attention, her elegant features betraying nothing of her inner thoughts. "And the significance of these alterations, Mr. Greeley?" "It means," he replied, removing his gloves with deliberate precision, "that while the core components are authentic, the mirror as a complete, unrestored artifact is not. Such extensive work suggests either significant damage requiring repair or—" He paused meaningfully. "A deliberate attempt to conceal something within the frame's construction." The implications of this statement seemed to hang in the air like incense, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Miss Marple, observing from the garden path through the tall windows, noted the way Mrs. Ashworth's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly at these words. The obvious suspect emerges. By noon, the village had processed Greeley's findings through its efficient gossip network and reached a collective conclusion that satisfied both logic and the human need for clear villains. Mrs. Ashworth, previously viewed as merely an elegant newcomer with expensive tastes, now found herself cast in the role of primary suspect in what was increasingly being termed the mirror incident. Mrs. Price Ridley, never one to miss an opportunity for dramatic pronouncement, had quickly established herself as the leading proponent of Mrs. Ashworth's guilt. "It's perfectly obvious," she declared to anyone within earshot at the post office. "She deliberately brought that cursed object here, knowing it would affect poor Mrs. Clement. The woman has been planning this from the moment she arrived in St. Mary Mead. Mark my words, there's something deeply calculating about Helena Ashworth." Even Mrs. Bantry, usually inclined toward charitable interpretations, found herself wrestling with uncomfortable doubts. "It does seem rather coincidental," she confided to Miss Marple during their afternoon telephone conversation. The timing of her arrival, the prominence she gave to that particular mirror, and then poor Mrs. Clement's violent reaction. And Helena did seem rather pleased with herself before the collapse occurred, didn't she? The village's collective judgment gained momentum throughout the day, fed by small observations that suddenly seemed significant in retrospect. Mrs. Ashworth's careful positioning during the tea party, her theatrical presentation of the mirror's history, her apparent lack of genuine concern for Mrs. Clement's distress. All were reinterpreted through the lens of suspicion until a portrait emerged of a woman capable of deliberate psychological cruelty. Inspector Slack's investigation. The arrival of Inspector Slack that afternoon brought official weight to the village's amateur theorizing. The inspector, a methodical man who preferred his crime straightforward and his suspects obvious, established himself at the village inn and began conducting interviews with characteristic efficiency. Miss Marple, who happened to be returning from the post office at the precise moment Mrs. Morrison emerged from her interview, observed the young woman's visible distress with interest. Mrs. Morrison sought her out immediately, clearly needing to unburden herself to someone who might understand the significance of what she had witnessed. "He thinks I'm suffering from feminine hysteria," Mrs. Morrison confided, settling into Miss Marple's sitting room with obvious relief. "Inspector Slack seems convinced that what I saw in the mirror was some sort of delusion brought on by the excitement of the gathering. But Miss Marple, I know what I saw. There was a man in that reflection who didn't belong there, and Mrs. Clement recognized him." The inspector's focus, according to Mrs. Morrison, had been less on her description of the mysterious figure and more on establishing timelines, connections, and potential motives among the Tea Party attendees. His questions had centered particularly on Mrs. Ashworth's behavior and any prior interactions between the various ladies present. A hidden clue, overlooked. While the village buzzed with theories and Inspector Slack pursued his methodical questioning, Miss Marple found herself drawn back to details that others had dismissed as insignificant. Her second visit to Mrs. Clement that evening, ostensibly to offer continued support, revealed something that troubled her considerably. The widow received her in the vicarage parlor with restored composure, but Miss Marple's experienced eye caught details that spoke volumes about the woman's true state of mind. Most significantly, she noticed that Mrs. Clement had arranged several small mirrors throughout the room. A hand mirror face down on the side table, a decorative looking glass turned toward the wall, even the glass front of a picture frame covered with a delicate doily. "Mirrors can be such treacherous things," Mrs. Clement observed, following Miss Marple's gaze. "They show us not just what is, but sometimes what was, or what we fear might be again." More revealing still was Mrs. Clement's unconscious behavior throughout their conversation. Her fingers repeatedly moved to her throat in a protective gesture, and Miss Marple noticed that the faint discoloration she had observed the previous day had darkened rather than faded. These were not the marks of recent violence, but the ghostly remnants of old injuries, the kind that spoke of systematic abuse endured over time. "Mrs. Ashworth," Mrs. Clement said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper, "was not unknown to me before yesterday. I realize that now. The mirror didn't show me supernatural visions. It triggered memories I'd deliberately forgotten. Memories of a woman who presented herself as a friend while systematically destroying everything I held dear. The investigation deepens." As the evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the curious intersection of past and present that seemed to define this particular mystery. The village had settled comfortably on Mrs. Ashworth as their primary suspect. Inspector Slack was pursuing his investigation along predictably official lines, and the obvious motives of jealousy and malicious intent satisfied everyone's need for comprehensible villainy. Yet something about the neat resolution troubled her deeply. In her experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood human psychology well enough to manipulate it, creating situations where their victims would be discredited before they could speak the truth. The timing of Mrs. Ashworth's arrival in St. Mary Mead, where the eye, careful selection and presentation of the mirror, even the convenient alterations that Greeley had discovered, all suggested a level of premeditation that went far beyond simple malice. The bruising on Mrs. Clement's throat told its own story, one that had nothing to do with supernatural influences or feminine hysteria. These were the physical remnants of very real violence, carefully hidden, but still visible to those who knew what to look for. The mirror hadn't created Mrs. Clement's terror. It had simply reflected back a truth that someone had gone to considerable lengths to bury. Escalating tensions. The day concluded with an unexpected development that promised to shift the investigation in new directions. Mrs. Ashworth, perhaps recognizing that village opinion had turned decisively against her, made a formal complaint to Inspector Slack regarding what she termed a campaign of harassment and defamation being conducted by certain members of the community. The complaint specifically named Mrs. Clement as the primary source of malicious accusations and requested official protection from what Mrs. Ashworth characterized as the unstable behavior of a woman clearly suffering from mental disturbance. She provided Inspector Slack with a detailed account, of Mrs. Clement's uninvited appearance at Greenvale Manor that morning, her disturbed behavior in the long gallery, and her subsequent attempts to spread completely unfounded allegations about Mrs. Ashworth's character and intentions. The strategy was both clever and ruthless, Miss Marple reflected as news of the complaint spread through the village telephone network. By casting herself as the victim of Mrs. Clement's alleged instability, Mrs. Ashworth had effectively inoculated herself against any accusations the widow might make, while simultaneously providing Inspector Slack with a tidy explanation for the entire affair. Yet the very precision of the maneuver suggested something that troubled Miss Marple considerably. In her experience, innocent people rarely responded to suspicion with such calculated counterattacks. The complaint felt less like the natural reaction of a wronged woman and more like the next move in a carefully orchestrated campaign, one that had begun long before Mrs. Ashworth ever set foot in St. Mary Mead. As the church bells chimed the evening hour, Miss Marple reflected on the curious way that mirrors could serve as both windows and weapons, revealing truths that some would kill to keep hidden, while simultaneously providing the means to destroy those who threatened to speak them. The village might have found its obvious suspect, but she suspected they had barely glimpsed the surface of a mystery that ran much deeper than anyone yet imagined. The real investigation, she realized, was only just beginning to reveal its true complexity. Tomorrow would bring new developments, and with them, perhaps, the first concrete evidence of whether they were dealing with simple malice or something far more sinister, and far more dangerous to those who dared to look too closely into the reflecting glass of the past. The morning brought with it an unseasonable chill that seemed to settle into the very stones of St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself had absorbed the tension of the previous day's revelations. Miss Marple, bearing a potted fern that had somehow survived 3 harsh winters, presented herself at Greenvale Manor under the unassailable banner of horticultural charity. Mrs. Ashworth received the offering with a graciousness that was almost too polished, and when Miss Marple suggested, with gentle persistence, that they place it in the long gallery where it might benefit from the northern light, she acquiesced with the kind of courtesy that concealed calculation. The physical investigation. The long gallery felt colder than the rest of the house, an effect that might have been attributed to its stone construction or perhaps to the weight of secrets it now contained. The mirror dominated one end of the space, its gilded frame catching what pale sunlight managed to penetrate the tall windows. Mr. Greeley and Ezra Pike were present, conferring in the low tones of professionals discussing technical matters, their voices echoing slightly in the vaulted space. As Miss Marple adjusted her fern on a small table positioned strategically near the mirror, her experienced eye catalogued several details that others might have overlooked. The mirror now hung perfectly level, a spirit level still resting on the chair beneath it as testimony to recent adjustment. She distinctly remembered its angle during the tea party, tilted slightly downward to capture more of the room and less of the ceiling. More significantly, at the very top edge of the gilded frame where the carving overhung the rebate, there was a faint smear of shellac, still tacky with the consistency of recent work. Ezra Pike, noticing her observant glance, offered information with the straightforward manner of an honest craftsman. "We removed the backing this morning," he explained simply. "Mrs. Ashworth wanted new, stronger hangers installed. I took the opportunity to examine the frame's condition." His weathered face showed the kind of professional pride that came from decades of careful work. "Found something curious, though. A shallow groove cut right into the rebate at the top. Like a runner, the sort you'd use to slide a thin panel down from above." "How practical," Miss Marple murmured, her pale blue eyes moving thoughtfully from the groove to the glass itself. "One imagines it would allow for adjustments to be made when circumstances required." Mr. Greeley, who had been listening with poorly concealed nervousness, interjected with professional authority. "The structural integrity remains sound despite the alterations. The frame's modifications don't compromise its abilities to support the glass safely. But it was Ezra's additional observation that proved most illuminating. "The glass itself tells its own story," he said, warming to his subject. "Original 18th century glass, no question, but it's been re-silvered at some point. You can tell by the way the light catches it. There's a different quality to new silvering, a clarity that old mirrors lose over time." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose theories were beginning to find confirmation. The re-silvering process would have required removing the old, reflective backing entirely, providing the perfect opportunity to place something, a painting, a photograph, perhaps even a carefully prepared image, behind the glass before applying the new silver coating. Such an image would appear to be part of the reflection while remaining completely static, creating the illusion of seeing something that wasn't actually present in the room. Mrs. Clement's revelations. That afternoon, Miss Marple found Mrs. Clement in the vicarage parlor, surrounded by the small comforts that spoke of a life carefully rebuilt after trauma. The widow had arranged the room with deliberate attention to mirrors. The hand mirror face down, a decorative-looking glass turned toward the wall, even the glass front of a picture frame covered with delicate lace. It was the behavior of someone who had learned to fear her own reflection. "I was married before," Mrs. Clement said after they had discussed the parish flower arrangements and the unseasonable weather. Her voice carried the particular strain of someone forcing herself to speak truths long buried. "At 19, to a man named Edmund Vale, it feels like a story I read once, not a life I lived." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm, creating the kind of peaceful atmosphere that encouraged confidences. She'd learned long ago that silence could be more eloquent than questions. He was handsome, admired in society, clever about making rooms look elegant, Mrs. Clement continued, her fingers unconsciously moving to the silk scarf at her throat. He collected beautiful things, mirrors most of all. He said a room without a mirror had no conversation with itself. The faintest smile touched her lips before fading. "We lived in London, in a house with very dark wallpaper in the front parlor, bottle-green damask that seemed to swallow light. He positioned his favorite mirror so that if you stood in just the right place, you could see both the parlor and the hallway reflected simultaneously." The detail struck Miss Marple as significant. He liked to watch people arrive. He liked games, Mrs. Clement replied quietly. He said they made life interesting. He would position me where I could observe guests in the mirror's reflection, noting their expressions when they thought themselves unobserved. He found people's unguarded moments amusing. Her voice grew smaller. When I refused to participate in his entertainments, when life refused to play according to his rules, he used his hands to ensure compliance. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of years of carefully maintained silence. Miss Marple noted the way Mrs. Clement's fingers traced the edge of her scarf, protecting old wounds that had never fully healed. "He died several years ago," Mrs. Clement added with careful neutrality. "A fall down the stairs. People said I was fortunate to be free of him, and after a time I came here and married Mr. Clement. I've been happy, truly happy, for the first time in my adult life." "And Mrs. Ashworth?" Miss Marple asked, with a gentle tact that made difficult questions seem like natural conversation. Mrs. Clement's composure flickered. "I didn't think I knew her, but when I saw that mirror, positioned at exactly the angle Edmund preferred, reflecting the same dark tones he favored, I saw him standing behind me again, just as he used to. The terror was so vivid, so immediate, that for a moment I believed he had somehow returned." Inspector Slack's limited investigation. Inspector Slack's methodical approach to the case reflected both his professional competence and his fundamental limitations in dealing with the subtle psychological warfare that characterized village life. His interviews had established a clear narrative that satisfied his need for logical causation. Mrs. Ashworth had presented a valuable antique. Mrs. Clement had reacted with inexplicable violence, and now Mrs. Clement was making wild accusations to deflect attention from her own unstable behavior. Mrs. Ashworth's formal complaint had provided him with a framework that made sense within his experience of domestic disputes and social tensions. Her calm, rational presentation of events contrasted sharply with Mrs. Clement's fragile demeanor and cryptic references to past traumas, lending credence to the theory that they were dealing with a woman of delicate mental constitution rather than genuine criminal activity. The inspector's dismissal of Mrs. Morrison's testimony about seeing a man in the mirror reflected his practical approach to evidence. Feminine hysteria, brought on by excitement, he had noted in his report, categorizing the incident as a case of suggestible individuals feeding off each other's emotional distress rather than anything requiring serious investigation. The hidden clue. Revealed. For Miss Marple, however, the crucial clue lay not in the obvious suspects or dramatic accusations, but in understanding the true nature of the mirror's deception. The re-silvering that Ezra Pike had identified wasn't simply restoration work. It was the key to a sophisticated psychological weapon. If an image had been placed behind the glass before the new silver coating was applied, it would appear as part of the reflection while remaining completely static. Mrs. Morrison's description of a man who cast no reflection of his own suddenly made perfect sense. She had seen a fixed image that appeared to be part of the mirror's reflection, but didn't move or change as a true reflection would. The technical explanation was elegantly simple and entirely consistent with the period's restoration techniques. More importantly, it suggested a level of premeditation that went far beyond simple malice. Someone had taken considerable time, expense, and expertise to create this particular effect, knowing exactly how Mrs. Clement would react to seeing Edmund Vale's image positioned behind her reflection. Mrs. Ashworth's strategic counterattack. The afternoon brought news that Mrs. Ashworth had expanded her formal complaint to include allegations of harassment and defamation by certain village residents who were spreading malicious rumors about her character and intentions. The complaint specifically cited Mrs. Clement's unstable accusations and requested official protection from what she characterized as a campaign of persecution by individuals clearly suffering from mental disturbance. The strategy was both clever and ruthless, effectively inoculating Mrs. Ashworth against any accusations Mrs. Clement might make, while providing Inspector Slack with a tidy explanation for the entire affair. By positioning herself as the victim of Mrs. Clement's alleged instability, she had turned the investigation's focus away from her own actions and toward her accuser's mental state. Miss Marple recognized the maneuver as the work of someone with considerable experience in manipulating official investigations. The timing, the language, the careful documentation all suggested a mind that understood how to use institutional authority as a weapon against those who threatened to expose uncomfortable truth. Evening reflections. As darkness settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the elegant cruelty of the deception they were confronting. The mirror hadn't shown Mrs. Clement supernatural visions. It had forced her to confront a carefully crafted recreation of her most traumatic memories, triggered by the precise positioning and angle that Edmund Vale had used to torment her years before. The question that remained was how Mrs. Ashworth had acquired such intimate knowledge of Mrs. Clement's past. The level of detail required, the specific angle, the dark wallpaper tones, even Edmund Vale's physical appearance, suggested a connection that went far deeper than casual acquaintance. Mrs. Morrison's final visit of the evening provided one additional piece of the puzzle. "I've been thinking about what I saw in that mirror," she confided, settling into Miss Marple's sitting room with obvious relief. "The man's clothing, it wasn't modern dress, but the formal attire that gentlemen wore years ago, and his hands. They were positioned as if he were reaching for someone, but the gesture seemed threatening rather than affectionate." The detail confirmed Miss Marple's growing understanding of the mirror's true purpose. It had been designed not merely to startle or frighten, but to recreate a specific traumatic memory with such precision that the victim would be unable to distinguish past from present. The psychological sophistication required for such an attack suggested someone with both intimate knowledge of Mrs. Clement's history and considerable expertise in the manipulation of human consciousness. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, would bring the moment when careful observation and patient deduction would need to give way to more direct action. The mirror had revealed its secrets, Mrs. Clement had found the courage to speak her truth, and Mrs. Ashworth's careful facade was beginning to show cracks under the pressure of maintaining multiple deceptions simultaneously. The real confrontation was yet to come, but the groundwork had been laid for exposing a crime that was all the more heinous for its psychological sophistication and calculated cruelty. In her long experience with human nature's darker impulses, Miss Marple had rarely encountered such deliberate torture disguised as social courtesy, but she had also rarely felt more confident that justice would ultimately prevail over even the most carefully constructed deception. The gray morning light filtered through St. Mary Mead's windows with unusual reluctance, as if even the sun hesitated to illuminate the secrets that were beginning to surface in the village's most respectable drawing rooms. Miss Marple, having completed her morning correspondence and selected a particularly fine jar of her homemade marmalade as a calling card, set forth on what she privately termed her fact-gathering expedition, though to any observer she appeared to be making nothing more than her customary charitable rounds, morning discoveries and connections. Her first call took her to Mrs. Haydock, whose husband's medical practice had made her privy to more village confidences than most residents realized. The doctor's wife received Miss Marple in her comfortable morning room, clearly troubled by thoughts that had kept her awake through the night. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding Mrs. Clement's past," Mrs. Haydock began without preamble, her usual directness sharpened by concern. "Something has been troubling me about Helena Ashworth's arrival here. You see, Mrs. Clement had been corresponding with various London antique dealers about donations for the Church Restoration Fund. One of the firms she contacted was Greeley & Associates, the same firm that authenticated Helena's mirror." Miss Marple's needles paused in their steady rhythm. The connection struck her as profoundly significant. Mrs. Clement's correspondence would have included details about her, current circumstances, her address in St. Mary Mead, possibly even references to her previous marriage if she had been inquiring about inherited pieces. "There's something else," Mrs. Haydock continued, lowering her voice despite the privacy of her own home. "I took the liberty of checking the parish records about Greenvale Manor. Helena claimed she inherited it from a distant cousin, but Colonel Marsden, the previous owner, had no living relatives. He left the property to a charitable trust, which sold it at auction 6 months ago. Helena Ashworth purchased it outright, paying considerably above the asking price." The pattern was becoming clearer with each revelation. Mrs. Ashworth had not simply inherited her way into St. Mary Mead. She had deliberately positioned herself there, investing significant resources in establishing her presence in the very village where Mrs. Clement had found refuge from her traumatic past. Technical revelations at Greenvale. Miss Marple's next visit took her to Greenvale Manor, where Ezra Pike was making final adjustments to the mirror's mounting. The craftsman, honest to his core and troubled by details that didn't align with normal restoration work, had continued his examination of the frame's construction. "I couldn't rest easy about that groove I cut," he confided to Miss Marple as they stood in the long gallery. "So I examined the frame more carefully this morning. There's something you should see, Miss Marple." He led her to where a ladder still stood beneath the mirror, pointing to the ornate carving at the top of the frame. "See this molding here? There's a narrow channel cut behind it, just wide enough for a thin piece of glass or mica to slide down in front of the mirror's surface. And look here," he indicated a nearly invisible smear of paint along the gilt. "Verdigris with an underlying brown. That's the color of old damask, Miss Marple. Someone painted a sample right onto the frame." Miss Marple studied the evidence with growing understanding. The technical sophistication was remarkable. A sliding panel that could be positioned to create the illusion of a figure standing in the reflection, painted in colors that would evoke specific memories for someone who had lived with dark green damask wallpaper. "And there's this," Pike added, reaching carefully behind the cornice, where a tall person might conceal something. His fingers found the edge of a thin rectangle wrapped in silk to prevent scratching. A piece of prepared glass with what looks like a man's figure painted on it. Slide it down that groove and it would appear to be part of the mirror's reflection while remaining completely still. No natural movement like a real reflection would have. The mechanism was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. Mrs. Morrison's description of a man who cast no reflection of his own suddenly made perfect sense. She had seen a static image designed to appear as part of the mirror's surface while betraying its artificial nature through its lack of natural movement. The Eleanor Vance connection. It was Mrs. Bantry who provided the crucial piece of personal history that transformed the technical evidence into a coherent motive. Over afternoon tea, her encyclopedic knowledge of society scandals proved invaluable in connecting the present mystery to events that had occurred years before in London's more fashionable circles. There was a dreadful scandal involving Edmund Vale before his marriage to our Mrs. Clement, Mrs. Bantry revealed, her voice carrying the particular tone reserved for truly shocking revelations. He was engaged to a young woman named Eleanor Vance, beautiful, well-bred, but not particularly wealthy. He broke the engagement quite brutally, leaving her utterly disgraced. The poor girl disappeared from society entirely. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. And what became of Miss Vance's family? Her mother died shortly after the scandal. Some said from the shame of it all. Her father owned property in the countryside, including what is now Greenvale Manor, but he was quite broken by his daughter's disgrace. When he died, the property passed to distant relatives of the Ashworth family. Mrs. Bantry paused meaningfully. Eleanor Vance was never heard from again. Some said she went abroad, others that she had taken a new name entirely. The implications were staggering. Eleanor Vance, destroyed by Edmund Vale's cruelty, had not simply vanished. She had transformed herself into Helena Ashworth, spending years planning an elaborate revenge against the man who had ruined her life. When Edmund died before she could confront him directly, she had turned her attention to his widow, the woman who had achieved the marriage and respectability that should have been Eleanor's own. Inspector Slack's limitations. Miss Marple's attempt to share her growing understanding with Inspector Slack met with predictable resistance. The inspector, comfortable with his neat theory about feminine hysteria and social misunderstandings, had no patience for complex psychological motivations or technical explanations of mirror manipulation. "Miss Marple," he said with the forced patience he reserved for well-meaning but misguided civilians, "we are dealing with facts, not village gossip. Mrs. Ashworth is a respectable woman who has made a formal complaint about harassment. Mrs. Clement, while clearly distressed, shows no evidence of recent physical harm, and Mrs. Morrison's vision is obviously the product of an overexcited imagination." His dismissal of the evidence reflected both his professional limitations and his preference for cases that resolved themselves without requiring deep investigation into human psychology or sophisticated criminal methods. Mrs. Ashworth's strategic complaint had effectively neutralized official scrutiny while positioning her as the victim rather than the perpetrator. The hidden evidence emerges. The afternoon brought a development that would provide concrete proof of the conspiracy Miss Marple had begun to uncover. Ezra Pike, unable to rest easy about the mirror's strange modifications, had returned to examine it more thoroughly. His discoveries, when he brought them to Miss Marple that evening, confirmed her worst suspicions about the systematic nature of Mrs. Ashworth's psychological warfare. "I found something hidden in the frame's backing," he reported, producing a collection of items that told a chilling story. There's a compartment built into the structure, accessible only when the mirror is removed from the wall. Inside were photographs of Mrs. Clement, taken without her knowledge, copies of her correspondence with London dealers, and these, the personal effects he displayed, were unmistakably from Edmund Vale's estate. A distinctive signet ring, a silver locket that Mrs. Clement had mentioned in her whispered confidences, and most damning of all, what appeared to be a detailed psychological profile of Mrs. Clement's vulnerabilities, complete with recommendations for optimal trauma recreation. The evidence painted a picture of systematic stalking and psychological manipulation that went far beyond simple revenge. Mrs. Ashworth had spent months, perhaps years, studying her victim's habits, fears, and triggers, crafting a weapon specifically designed to destroy Mrs. Clement's carefully rebuilt peace of mind. The desperate gambit. As evening approached, news reached Miss Marple that would signal the beginning of the conspiracy's final, most dangerous phase. A telephone call from Mrs. Bantry brought word that Greenvale Manor had been burglarized. Specifically, the long gallery had been broken into through a smashed window, and the mirror had been stolen. The theft struck Miss Marple as far from random. The mirror was not merely a valuable antique, it was the primary evidence of Mrs. Ashworth's elaborate psychological attack. Its disappearance suggested that Eleanor Vance, now cornered by mounting suspicion and the discovery of her hidden evidence, was taking increasingly desperate measures to cover her tracks. Mrs. Ashworth's reaction to the theft, according to witnesses, had been perfectly calculated. She appeared genuinely distressed, insisted that the mirror had been her most treasured possession, and suggested that Mrs. Clement's obsession with the piece had finally driven her to criminal behavior. The performance was masterful, turning what was clearly evidence destruction into further proof of Mrs. Clement's alleged instability. The stakes escalate. As the church bells chimed the evening hour, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the elegant cruelty of the revenge they were confronting. Eleanor Vance had not simply sought to frighten or embarrass Mrs. Clement. She had crafted a systematic campaign designed to destroy her rival's sanity and reputation while positioning herself as the innocent victim of a disturbed woman's jealousy. The psychological sophistication was remarkable and terrifying. By recreating the specific visual and emotional triggers of Mrs. Clement's most traumatic memories, Mrs. Ashworth had turned the mirror into a weapon more precise than any blade. The re-silvered glass, the sliding panel with Edmund's painted image, the careful positioning to evoke the dark damask parlor where so much abuse had occurred. Every detail had been calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage while appearing to be supernatural or coincidental to casual observers. But the theft of the mirror marked a crucial turning point. Eleanor Vance's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack under the pressure of maintaining multiple deceptions simultaneously. Her transformation from victim to perpetrator was becoming visible to those who knew how to look, and Miss Marple suspected that her next moves would be increasingly desperate and dangerous. Preparing for confrontation. The evening concluded with Miss Marple's quiet reflection on the curious way that mirrors could serve as both windows into the past and weapons against the present. In her long experience with human nature's capacity for both suffering and cruelty, she had rarely encountered such sophisticated psychological warfare disguised as social courtesy. Eleanor Vance's revenge had been years in the making, requiring extensive resources, careful planning, and a deep understanding of her victim's psychological vulnerabilities. The mirror had been crafted not merely to startle or frighten, but to recreate trauma with such precision that Mrs. Clement would be unable to distinguish memory from reality, past from present. But the very sophistication of the attack had also created opportunities for its exposure. The technical modifications required for the deception, the hidden compartment with its damning evidence, and the increasingly desperate measures to cover the conspiracy's tracks, all provided threads that a careful investigator could follow back to their source. Tomorrow, Miss Marple knew, would bring the moment when patient observation and gentle questioning would need to give way to direct confrontation. Eleanor Vance had spent years planning her revenge, but she had underestimated both the resilience of her intended victim and the determination of those who refused to let sophisticated cruelty triumph over justice. The mirror might be gone, but its reflections had revealed truths that could no longer be hidden. The final act of this particular drama was about to begin, and Miss Marple intended to ensure that it ended with justice rather than the destruction of an innocent woman who had already suffered far more than any person should be asked to endure. The village of St. Mary Mead had become a battlefield where past and present collided, where carefully buried secrets fought to remain hidden, and where the ultimate question was whether truth and compassion could overcome even the most elegantly constructed campaign of psychological terror. The answer, Miss Marple reflected as she prepared for the confrontations to come, would depend on courage, both her own and that of a woman who had already shown remarkable strength in surviving one monster and now faced the challenge of defeating another. The morning after the mirror's theft dawned grey and uncertain over St. Mary Mead, as if the very sky reflected the village's collective unease about the events that continued to unfold in their midst. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night contemplating the implications of such a convenient burglary, rose early and set about what she privately termed her archaeological expedition. Though to any observer, she appeared to be taking nothing more than her customary morning constitutional toward the old limestone quarry beyond Greenvale Manor. The evidence that survived. Young Tommy Pierce, whose curiosity about the previous evening's activities had led him to explore the quarry at first light, intercepted Miss Marple near the manor gates with news that confirmed her worst suspicions. "There's been a right proper bonfire up at the quarry, Miss Marple," he reported breathlessly. "Still smoking it is, and bits of glass and gold scattered about like someone tried to destroy something valuable." The scene at the quarry told its story with devastating clarity. The mirror had been systematically destroyed in what was clearly a desperate attempt to eliminate evidence. The glass lay shattered beyond any hope of reconstruction, the ornate frame reduced to charred fragments that would yield no secrets about hidden compartments or sliding mechanisms. Yet Eleanor Vance's desperation had led to carelessness that would prove her undoing. Among the debris, Miss Marple discovered several items that the flames had failed to consume completely. A partially burned photograph showing Mrs. Clement in her garden, taken clearly without her knowledge or consent. Fragments of correspondence bearing the letterhead of Greeley and Associates, including what appeared to be detailed instructions for creating authentic period modifications to antique mirrors. Most damning of all, the metal clasp of a leather portfolio had survived the fire, and etched into its surface was a monogram that revealed everything. E.V. Eleanor Vance, not Helena Ashworth. "How very thorough," Miss Marple murmured, carefully collecting the evidence in her handkerchief, though perhaps not quite thorough enough. Mrs. Clement finds her voice. Armed with concrete proof of the systematic deception that had been practiced against her, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where she found Mrs. Clement in her small morning room. The widow had clearly spent a sleepless night as well, but there was something different about her demeanor. A straightness to her spine and a clarity in her gaze that spoke of important decisions made in the darkness of solitary reflection. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding mirrors and memory," Mrs. Clement began without preamble, her voice carrying a strength that had been absent since the Tea Party incident, about how some reflections force us to confront truths we'd rather forget. I realize now that running from the past only gives it power over the present. She had spent the night arranging documents that told the story of her first marriage with painful honesty. Medical records documenting injuries explained as household accidents. Correspondence revealing Edmund Vale's systematic isolation of her from family and friends. Most significantly, a diary she had kept hidden for years that detailed the psychological torments he had inflicted with such calculated precision. Edmund had what he called Interesting theories about human nature, she explained, her fingers steady as she turned the diary's pages. He believed that people's true characters emerged when they were forced to confront unexpected reflections of themselves. He positioned mirrors throughout our London house to create what he termed psychological experiments, situations where I would see him approaching from behind when I thought I was alone, where his image would appear suddenly in my peripheral vision. The diary entries revealed a pattern of sophisticated psychological abuse that made Mrs. Ashworth's mirror deception seem like a direct continuation of Edmund's methods. The dark damask wallpaper, the specific angles of reflection, the careful positioning to create maximum emotional impact, all had been Edmund's innovations, now recreated by someone who understood their devastating effectiveness with scientific precision. There was a young woman before me, Mrs. Clement continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. Eleanor Vance. Edmund was engaged to her, but he ended it in the cruelest possible manner. He invited her to what she believed would be a reconciliation dinner, positioned her where she could see herself in his favorite mirror, then announced that he found her reflection insufficiently compelling for a lifetime of observation. The campaign of intimidation escalates. The afternoon brought disturbing news that demonstrated Eleanor Vance's increasing desperation. Mrs. Morrison's cottage had been the target of what appeared to be a burglary, though the nature of the crime suggested motives far more sinister than simple theft. Nothing of significant monetary value had been taken, but the interior showed signs of systematic, almost ritualistic destruction. Mrs. Bantry, who had discovered the scene when Mrs. Morrison failed to appear for their planned shopping expedition, described it with barely controlled horror. It wasn't random vandalism, she reported to Miss Marple over the telephone. Every mirror in the house had been smashed, the fragments arranged in deliberate patterns, and Jane, on Mrs. Morrison's pillow, spelled out in broken glass, was the word silence. The message was unmistakably clear. Those who spoke uncomfortable truths about mirrors and their reflections would face consequences. Mrs. Morrison, whose accurate description of seeing a man who cast no reflection had been dismissed as feminine hysteria, was now being systematically terrorized for her honesty. Inspector Slack, confronted with this second crime, found his neat theories about Mrs. Clement's alleged instability becoming increasingly untenable. The professional precision of the Greenvale Manor burglary contrasted sharply with the personal, psychologically targeted nature of the attack on Mrs. Morrison's cottage. The theatrical arrangement of broken mirror fragments suggested a perpetrator with both intimate knowledge of the ongoing investigation and a clear motive to silence potential witnesses. Miss Marple's careful test. Recognizing that Eleanor Vance's increasing desperation was making her both more dangerous and more vulnerable to exposure, Miss Marple decided that the time had come for a more direct approach. She arranged what she described to Mrs. Bantry as a small committee meeting to discuss the church flower arrangements, though her true purpose was far more complex. The gathering took place in Mrs. Bantry's drawing room with its large windows and excellent natural light. Miss Marple had specifically requested that the old pier glass from the west bedroom be brought down, a simple, honest mirror that reflected only what was actually present, without deception or manipulation. She had also prepared what appeared to be fabric samples for the autumn decorations, including a piece of dark green damask that she had discovered in the back of her own linen cupboard. Mrs. Ashworth arrived precisely on time, her elegant composure intact, but perhaps requiring slightly more effort to maintain than previously. She positioned herself with her customary grace, though Miss Marple noted that her eyes moved immediately to assess the mirror's angle and positioning, the automatic reaction of someone accustomed to calculating reflective possibilities. Such a practical mirror, Miss Marple observed mildly, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm. It shows only what is actually there, without embellishment or artistic interpretation. Some antique mirrors, I'm told, can be quite deceptive, especially when they have been modified by skilled craftsmen. The comment was innocent enough, but Miss Marple observed the way Mrs. Ashworth's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her teacup handle. When the conversation turned to the recent burglaries, Mrs. Ashworth expressed appropriate concern while subtly reinforcing her narrative about Mrs. Clement's deteriorating mental state. The poor woman is clearly suffering from some form of persecution complex, she suggested with well-practiced sympathy. First the delusion about my mirror, now these increasingly erratic acts of vandalism. I do hope she receives the professional help she so obviously needs. The psychological slip. Miss Marple's opportunity came when Mrs. Bantry mentioned the specific positioning of the broken glass at Mrs. Morrison's cottage. Arranged in such deliberate patterns, she said with a shudder, almost like someone was creating a message or symbol. Mirrors can be such powerful symbols, Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully. In my experience, people who understand their psychological impact often have very personal reasons for that knowledge. Edmund Vale, for instance, Mrs. Clement mentioned that he had quite sophisticated theories about reflective surfaces and their effect on human behavior. Mrs. Ashworth's reaction was swift and telling. Edmund never understood the true power of mirrors, she said before catching herself. That is, from what I've heard about such psychological theories in general. The slip was small, but significant. Mrs. Ashworth had spoken of Edmund Vale with the familiarity of personal knowledge, using his first name and expressing a definitive opinion about his understanding, or lack thereof, of mirrors' psychological impact. It was the kind of intimate assessment that could only come from direct experience, not casual acquaintance with psychological theories. Miss Marple continued her gentle probing, discussing the technical aspects of mirror modification and the skill required to create convincing false reflections. She mentioned, with apparent innocence, that such work would require extensive knowledge of the intended victim's specific psychological vulnerabilities. One would need to know precisely which memories to trigger, she observed, her pale blue eyes fixed on her knitting. The exact positioning that would recreate a traumatic experience, the specific visual elements that would prove most disturbing. Such intimate knowledge suggests either extensive research or personal familiarity with the original circumstances. Mrs. Ashworth's composure held, but Miss Marple noted the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her breathing had become more controlled and deliberate. The elegant mask was still in place, but cracks were beginning to show beneath the surface. The web tightens. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple shared selected details from her morning's discoveries at the quarry, carefully omitting the most damning evidence while revealing enough to gauge Mrs. Ashworth's reactions. She mentioned the burned correspondence with Greeley and Associates, the photographic evidence of surveillance, and the systematic nature of the evidence destruction. Such thorough work, she commented admiringly. Though in my experience, the most careful criminals sometimes overlook the smallest details. A monogram here, a distinctive handwriting sample there, little things that seem insignificant until they're viewed as part of a larger pattern. Mrs. Ashworth's response was perfectly controlled, but Miss Marple caught the brief flicker of calculation in her eyes, the look of someone rapidly assessing what evidence might have survived and how much her interrogator actually knew. The psychological game was delicate and dangerous. Eleanor Vance was clearly a woman of considerable intelligence and sophistication, capable of maintaining her deception under significant pressure. But the strain of managing multiple identities, covering increasingly complex lies, and dealing with the unexpected resistance from her intended victims was beginning to tell. Evening reflections. As the gathering concluded and Mrs. Ashworth departed with her usual grace, Miss Marple reflected on the afternoon's revelations. The slip about Edmund Vale had been small but telling, confirming her growing certainty about Helena Ashworth's true identity. The technical evidence from the quarry provided concrete proof of the systematic deception, while the escalating attacks on Mrs. Morrison demonstrated Eleanor Vance's increasing desperation and willingness to use violence to protect her carefully constructed facade. The psychological sophistication of the campaign was remarkable and terrifying. Eleanor Vance had not simply sought revenge. She had crafted a systematic program of psychological warfare designed to destroy Mrs. Clement's sanity and reputation while positioning herself as the innocent victim of a disturbed woman's jealousy. The mirror had been merely the opening gambit in a much larger game of manipulation and control. But the very complexity of the deception was also creating opportunities for its exposure. The multiple identities required constant vigilance to maintain. The technical modifications left physical evidence that could be analyzed, and the psychological pressure of sustaining such an elaborate lie was forcing Eleanor Vance into increasingly desperate and revealing actions. Tomorrow, Miss Marple knew, would bring the moment when careful observation and gentle questioning would need to give way to direct confrontation. The evidence was mounting, Mrs. Clement was finding her courage, and Eleanor Vance's mask was beginning to slip under the pressure of maintaining her deception. The mirror that had started it all was gone, destroyed in a desperate attempt to eliminate evidence, but its reflections had revealed truths that could no longer be hidden. The final act of this particular drama was approaching, and Miss Marple intended to ensure that it ended with justice rather than the destruction of an innocent woman who had already endured far more than any person should be asked to bear. The village of St. Mary Mead had become a battlefield where past and present collided, where sophisticated psychological warfare masqueraded as social courtesy, and where the ultimate question was whether truth and compassion could triumph over even the most elegantly constructed campaign of revenge. The answer would depend on courage, both her own and that of those who had learned to see through the reflecting glass of deception to the human truth beneath. The morning brought with it an unseasonable chill that seemed to settle into the very bones of St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself sensed that the careful game of deception and counter-deception was approaching its most dangerous phase. Miss Marple, having spent the pre-dawn hours organizing the evidence she had methodically gathered, knew that the time for gentle observation was drawing to a close. Eleanor Vance's increasing desperation was making her both more dangerous and more vulnerable to the kind of psychological pressure that would force her to reveal herself completely. Inspector Slack's awakening. Miss Marple's first task was to present Inspector Slack with evidence so compelling that even his preference for straightforward explanations could not dismiss it. She found him at the village inn, reviewing his notes with the satisfied air of a man who believed his case was nearly concluded. The small package she placed before him contained the fruits of her careful investigation, the partially burned photograph of Mrs. Clement taken without consent, fragments of correspondence with Greeley and Associates detailing period modifications to antique mirrors, and, most damning of all, the silver clasp bearing the monogram E.V. These were recovered from the quarry where the mirror was destroyed, Miss Marple explained with quiet precision, along with technical specifications that revealed the true purpose of those modifications Mr. Pike discovered. She laid out the evidence methodically, the sliding channel designed to hold a painted glass insert, the careful recreation of Edmund Vale's psychological torture methods, the systematic surveillance of Mrs. Clement's daily routine. Each piece built upon the others to create a picture of premeditated psychological warfare that even Inspector Slack's conventional mind could not ignore. The mirror was not simply a valuable antique, Inspector, she concluded. It was a weapon, crafted specifically to destroy Mrs. Clement's sanity by forcing her to relive her most traumatic memories. And Mrs. Ashworth is not who she claims to be. Mr. Greeley's convenient departure. The morning's revelations took on additional urgency when news arrived that Mr. Greeley had been found dead in his room at the Blue Boar, apparently by his own hand. The suicide note, written in what appeared to be his familiar script, confessed to guilt over fraudulent authentication and fear of exposure. Inspector Slack initially welcomed this development as a tidy conclusion to his investigation. Miss Marple, however, found the circumstances deeply troubling. Her examination of the scene revealed inconsistencies that spoke of careful staging rather than genuine despair. The wrong type of ink for the hotel's standard pen, the absence of proper impressions on the blotter, and most tellingly, 2 teacups on the washstand, one bearing traces of lipstick, the other showing the faint ring of rouge near the rim. "Mr. Greeley was a whiskey-after-lunch gentleman," she observed to Inspector Slack. "I watched him refuse tea twice with the bored courtesy of someone managing provincial expectations. Such a man does not suddenly develop a taste for afternoon tea, particularly when writing what he believes to be his final words." The evidence suggested a meeting that had gone tragically wrong, or perhaps exactly as planned. A long brown hair caught in the lace curtain, the lingering scent of powder that the landlady's niece had noticed, the timing that coincided perfectly with Eleanor Vance's need to eliminate a potentially dangerous witness, all pointed to murder, disguised as suicide. The psychological preparation. Understanding that Eleanor Vance's sophistication required an equally sophisticated response, Miss Marple began preparing what she privately termed her final examination. The test would need to be subtle enough to avoid alerting Eleanor to its true purpose, while being decisive enough to force a revelation that could not be denied or explained away. She arranged for Mrs. Clement to be present but protected, surrounded by witnesses whose testimony could not be dismissed as feminine hysteria or village gossip. Dr. Haydock would provide medical authority, Mrs. Bantry would offer unshakable respectability, and Inspector Slack would ensure that any confessions could not be retracted later. The setting she chose was deliberately neutral. Mrs. Bantry's drawing room, with its excellent natural light and familiar atmosphere. Most importantly, she arranged for a simple, honest mirror to be present. Not an antique with hidden modifications, but a straightforward glass that would reflect only what was actually there. The careful test begins. Mrs. Ashworth arrived for what she believed was a routine committee meeting about church restoration, her elegant composure intact, but requiring what Miss Marple's experienced eye recognized as increasing effort to maintain. She positioned herself with calculated grace, though her eyes moved constantly to assess the room's occupants and potential exits. Miss Marple began with seemingly innocent conversation about historical preservation, gradually steering toward the topic of mirrors and their psychological effects. She mentioned, with apparent casualness, the fragments recovered from the quarry and the professional opinion that such deliberate destruction suggested intimate knowledge of the mirror's true purpose. The technical modifications were quite remarkable, she observed, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm. The kind of work that would require not just skilled craftsmanship, but detailed knowledge of the intended psychological impact on a specific individual. Mrs. Ashworth's response was perfectly controlled, but Miss Marple noted the subtle signs of increasing tension, the slight stiffening of her shoulders, the more deliberate pattern of her breathing, the way her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her teacup. The moment of truth, the crucial test, came when Miss Marple produced the burned portfolio clasp with its revealing monogram. "We found this among the debris," she said conversationally, placing the silver piece where everyone could see it clearly. "E.V. Such distinctive initials. They remind me of a young woman Mrs. Clement mentioned, someone who suffered terribly at Edmund Vale's hands before his marriage." The effect was immediate and devastating. For just a moment, Eleanor Vance's carefully maintained facade cracked like ice under sudden pressure. Her face drained of color as she stared at the physical proof of her true identity, and in that unguarded instant, Miss Marple saw not the elegant Mrs. Ashworth, but the bitter, damaged woman beneath. "Eleanor Vance," Miss Marple said gently but firmly. You've spent years planning this revenge, haven't you? Years studying Mrs. Clement's habits, her vulnerabilities, her carefully rebuilt life. The mirror was just the beginning, a test to see how effectively you could recreate Edmund's psychological torture. The facade crumbles. Once the mask had slipped, Eleanor's need to justify her actions proved stronger than her instinct for self-preservation. The sophisticated psychological warfare, the systematic stalking, the careful recreation of traumatic memories, all poured out in a confession that revealed the true scope of her campaign. "She stole everything that should have been mine," Eleanor said, her voice carrying none of Helena Ashworth's cultivated refinement. "The marriage, the respectability, the life I was promised. Edmund discarded me like a broken toy, destroyed my reputation and my family's honor. When he died before I could make him pay, she became the target of everything he owed me." The systematic nature of her revenge became clear as she described the years of preparation. Purchasing Greenvale Manor to establish her presence, commissioning the modified mirror from craftsmen who believed they were creating legitimate restoration work, timing her arrival to coincide with Mrs. Clement's most vulnerable moments. Mrs. Clement's strength. Throughout Eleanor's confession, Mrs. Clement remained remarkably composed, listening to the detailed description of the campaign against her with the quiet dignity that had carried her through so many trials. When Eleanor finally fell silent, Mrs. Clement spoke with calm authority. "You made one crucial error in your calculations," she said simply. "You assumed that surviving Edmund's abuse had left me permanently broken. You never considered that it had also made me stronger than you could imagine. Justice served." Inspector Slack, confronted with a detailed confession of systematic stalking, psychological warfare, and likely murder, found himself dealing with criminal sophistication far beyond his usual experience. Eleanor's admission of commissioning fraudulent restoration work, conducting illegal surveillance, and destroying evidence provided clear grounds for multiple charges. As Eleanor Vance was led away, her elegant facade finally shattered completely. Miss Marple reflected on the curious way that mirrors could serve as both weapons and revelations. Eleanor had attempted to use reflection to destroy Mrs. Clement's sanity, but in the end, it was the clear mirror of truth, honest observation, and courageous testimony that had exposed the real monster in their midst. The test concluded. The psychological test Miss Marple had devised had worked perfectly, not through trickery or deception, but through the simple presentation of truth that could no longer be denied. Eleanor Vance's sophisticated campaign of revenge had ultimately been defeated by something far more powerful than psychological manipulation, the strength of a community that refused to let evil triumph over innocence, and the resilience of a woman who had learned that surviving trauma could become a source of unshakable courage. The mirror that had started it all was gone, destroyed in a desperate attempt to eliminate evidence, but its true purpose had been revealed. It had been not a window into the supernatural, but a precisely crafted instrument of psychological torture, one that had ultimately reflected back upon its creator, revealing her true nature to those with the wisdom and courage to see clearly. As the village began to process the extraordinary events they had witnessed, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the deeper lesson of the case, that the most dangerous criminals are often those who understand human psychology well enough to weaponize it, but that such sophistication also creates vulnerabilities that careful observation and patient courage can exploit. The mirror had finally stopped reflecting lies and begun showing the truth that justice, however delayed, would ultimately prevail over even the most elegantly constructed campaign of revenge. The afternoon light in Mrs. Bantry's drawing room held the golden quality of autumn's end, as if the season itself recognized that the time for shadows and deception had finally passed. Miss Marple sat in her customary chair, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, as she prepared to weave together the final threads of a mystery that had revealed both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human resilience. The assembled company, Inspector Slack with his notebook finally filled with genuine evidence, Dr. Haydock lending medical authority, Mrs. Clement with her newfound strength, young Mrs. Morrison vindicated at last, and Ezra Pike with his craftsman's integrity, waited with the particular stillness that comes before truth is finally spoken. Miss Marple's complete revelation. "You see?" Miss Marple began gently, her pale blue eyes moving thoughtfully around the circle of faces. This was never truly about supernatural manifestations or feminine hysteria, as some preferred to believe. It was about something far more earthly and infinitely more cruel. The systematic application of psychological torture by someone who understood human vulnerability with scientific precision. She set down her knitting and folded her hands with quiet authority. Eleanor Vance spent years crafting what she believed would be the perfect revenge. She purchased Greenvale Manor not as a home, but as a stage for psychological warfare. She commissioned modifications to that mirror, not for historical accuracy, but to create a weapon more precise than any blade. The technical explanation emerged with crystalline clarity as Miss Marple described how Eleanor had employed two sophisticated deception methods simultaneously. The resilvering process had allowed Edmund Vale's painted image to be embedded behind the glass itself, appearing as part of any reflection while remaining completely static. Additionally, the sliding channel that Ezra Pike had discovered permitted a second painted insert to be positioned in front of the mirror's surface when needed, creating the illusion of supernatural manifestation while remaining entirely under Eleanor's control. Mrs. Morrison's observation about a man who cast no reflection of his own was the most accurate testimony we received, Miss Marple noted with gentle approval. She had seen exactly what Eleanor intended, a fixed image that appeared to be part of the reflection but betrayed its artificial nature through its complete lack of natural movement. The psychological warfare exposed. The true sophistication of Eleanor's campaign became clear as Miss Marple explained how every detail had been calculated for maximum psychological impact. The mirror's positioning replicated Edmund Vale's preferred angle exactly. The lighting had been arranged to evoke the dark damask tones of the London parlour where so much abuse had occurred. Even the timing of the tea party had been chosen to match the afternoon hours, when Edmund had conducted his most devastating experiments. Eleanor possessed Edmund's own journals. Mrs. Clement added with remarkable composure, producing the leather-bound volume that had provided the blueprint for psychological torture. Detailed records of his methods, charts documenting my reactions to different stimuli, even sketches showing optimal mirror positioning for maximum emotional distress. She didn't need to invent new cruelties. She simply recreated his existing ones with modern precision. The systematic nature of Eleanor's preparation was staggering. Surveillance photographs revealed months of careful observation. Correspondence with antique dealers had provided access to Mrs. Clement's personal information through seemingly innocent restoration inquiries. The purchase of Greenvale Manor and creation of the Helena Ashworth identity had required extensive resources and forged documentation sophisticated enough to withstand official scrutiny. The Greeley murder. Revealed. Inspector Slack's investigation had confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions about the antique dealer's convenient suicide. The evidence was quite conclusive once we knew what to look for, he reported with professional satisfaction. 2 teacups when Greeley was known to refuse tea, ink that didn't match the hotel's standard pen, no proper impressions on the blotter despite the supposed pressure of writing a confession. The long brown hair caught in the curtain lace, the lingering scent of powder, the timing that coincided perfectly with Eleanor's need to eliminate a dangerous witness, all pointed to murder disguised as suicide with calculated precision. Greeley's authentication work had created a paper trail that could have exposed the mirror's true purpose, making him a liability Eleanor could not afford to leave alive. The forged confession was skillfully done, Miss Marple observed, but Eleanor made the same error that ultimately undid her entire deception. She relied on technical perfection, while overlooking the human details that would have made her forgery truly convincing. The insurance fraud dimension. The investigation had revealed that Eleanor's scheme extended far beyond simple revenge into sophisticated financial fraud. The mirror's inflated insurance valuation, the convenient timing of coverage activation, and the staged theft were all designed to provide Eleanor with resources sufficient to disappear into a new identity once her psychological campaign was complete. She had planned not just to destroy Mrs. Clement's sanity, but to profit handsomely from the destruction, Inspector Slack noted grimly. The insurance payout would have funded her escape to anywhere in the world, leaving behind only the wreckage of an innocent woman's life. Character vindications and community healing. Mrs. Morrison, whose accurate observations had been dismissed as overwrought imagination, found herself vindicated by the technical explanation of the mirror's deception. You noticed the crucial detail that exposed the entire fraud, Miss Marple told her warmly. Your careful observation of what didn't behave like a natural reflection was the first concrete evidence of deliberate manipulation. Mrs. Clement's journey from victim to survivor had reached its culmination in her decision to speak publicly about Edmund's abuse and Eleanor's systematic stalking. Surviving Edmund's cruelty taught me something Eleanor never understood, she observed with quiet strength. That enduring systematic abuse can build an inner resilience that cannot be broken by external manipulation. The village of St. Mary Mead, confronted with evidence of such sophisticated criminal activity in their midst, had responded with characteristic determination to protect their own. Mrs. Bantry's unwavering support, Dr. Haydock's medical testimony, even Mrs. Price Ridley's dramatic proclamations, all had contributed to creating an environment where truth could emerge and be believed. The technical evidence assembled. Ezra Pike's craftsman's integrity had provided crucial evidence about the mirror's modifications. The groove cut behind the gilt molding, the hidden compartment accessible only when the mirror was completely removed, the resilvering work that allowed images to be embedded behind the glass, all demonstrated professional-level craftsmanship employed for criminal purposes. The fragments recovered from the quarry, despite Eleanor's desperate attempt at evidence destruction, had told their own story. The monogrammed portfolio clasp bearing EV, the partially burned surveillance photographs, the technical specifications for period modifications, all had survived the flames to provide concrete proof of the conspiracy's scope and sophistication. Eleanor's final exposure. The psychological test that had finally forced Eleanor to reveal herself had worked through the simple presentation of truth that could no longer be denied. Her slip about Edmund Vale, speaking of him with the intimacy of personal knowledge rather than casual acquaintance, had cracked the carefully maintained facade of Helena Ashworth. Eleanor underestimated the power of community observation, Miss Marple reflected. She planned her campaign assuming that isolated individuals would be vulnerable to psychological manipulation, but she failed to account for the strength that comes from mutual support and shared determination to protect the innocent. The deeper meaning. As the golden afternoon light began to fade, Miss Marple offered her final thoughts on a case that had revealed both the sophistication of human cruelty and the resilience of human goodness. Eleanor intended to use the mirror as a weapon of psychological warfare, forcing Mrs. Clement to see reflections of her most traumatic memories. But in the end, it was the clear mirror of honest observation and courageous testimony that revealed Eleanor's true nature to those with the wisdom to see clearly. The mirror had been crafted as an instrument of torture, but it had ultimately served as a catalyst for justice. Eleanor's technical sophistication had been formidable, but it had been overcome by something even more powerful: the determination of decent people to protect the innocent and ensure that truth prevailed over revenge. The village returned to peace, As the various participants in this extraordinary drama prepared to return to their normal lives, the village of St. Mary Mead began the gentle process of healing that communities undertake after confronting darkness in their midst. Greenvale Manor stood empty once more, its elegant facade now associated with sinister purposes, but the evil that had briefly inhabited it had been exposed and eliminated. Mrs. Clement found renewed strength in the public acknowledgement of her trauma and the validation of her courage. Mrs. Morrison discovered confidence in her own observations, understanding that sometimes the most innocent eyes could see the deepest truths. The community as a whole had learned that their peaceful surface could conceal profound dramas, but also that their collective commitment to justice could overcome even the most sophisticated deceptions. Miss Marple gathered her knitting as the meeting concluded, reflecting on the curious way that mirrors could serve as both weapons and revelations. "We've had the worst of it now," she said comfortably to the assembled company. "There may be unpleasantness still, solicitors and such, but the truth has a way of setting things to rights in its own fashion." The mirror that had started it all was gone, destroyed in Eleanor's desperate attempt to eliminate evidence, but its reflections had revealed truths that would endure. It had shown not supernatural visions or psychological manipulations, but the simple, powerful reality that evil, however sophisticated and carefully planned, would ultimately be exposed by those with the courage to look honestly into the glass of human nature and speak what they saw there. As the church bells chimed the evening hour, St. Mary Mead settled into the peaceful rhythm of a community that had confronted its darkest possibilities and emerged stronger for the experience. The mirror had finally stopped reflecting lies and begun showing the truth, that justice, however delayed, would ultimately prevail over even the most elegantly constructed campaign of revenge, and that the strength found in community and compassion could overcome any individual's capacity for sophisticated cruelty. The weeks that followed Eleanor Vance's arrest settled over St. Mary Mead like the gentle conclusion of a long-held breath, bringing with them the particular peace that comes to communities who have faced genuine darkness and emerged victorious through collective courage and determination. Miss Marple, having completed her morning correspondence and selected a spray of late chrysanthemums whose golden faces seemed to embody hope itself, made her way to Mrs. Bantry's drawing room for what had become their customary afternoon reflection on the extraordinary events that had so recently transformed their quiet village. Miss Marple's final accounting. Settling into her familiar chair with her knitting needles resuming their soothing rhythm, Miss Marple found herself surrounded by the key figures who had played such crucial roles in exposing Eleanor's elaborate deception. Mrs. Clement sat with newfound composure, no longer hiding behind scarves or shadows. Inspector Slack attended with his notebook finally filled with genuine understanding rather than dismissive theories. Mrs. Morrison bore the quiet confidence of someone whose observations had been vindicated. Dr. Haydock provided his steady medical authority, while Mrs. Bantry offered the warm hospitality that had made truth-telling possible. Looking back, Miss Marple began with her characteristic gentleness. "We can see how every detail fit together with the precision of a clockwork mechanism, though one designed for cruelty rather than beauty." Eleanor Vance spent years crafting what she believed would be the perfect psychological weapon, but she made one fundamental error. She underestimated both the resilience of her intended victim and the power of a community determined to protect its own. She explained how the technical sophistication had been remarkable, yet ultimately self-defeating. The resilvering process that embedded Edmund Vale's image behind the glass, the sliding channel that allowed additional painted elements to be positioned for maximum psychological impact, the careful recreation of lighting and angles from Mrs. Clement's traumatic past. All had required extensive planning and resources, creating a paper trail that careful investigation could follow. Mrs. Morrison's observation about a man who cast no reflection of his own was the key that unlocked everything, Miss Marple noted warmly. She had seen exactly what Eleanor intended, a static image that appeared to be part of the reflection, but betrayed its artificial nature through its complete lack of natural movement. That single, honest observation exposed the entire deception. The psychological warfare had been systematic and sophisticated, designed not merely to frighten, but to recreate specific traumatic memories with scientific precision. Eleanor had possessed Edmund's own journals, documenting his methods of abuse, providing her with a blueprint for psychological torture that she had adapted with modern techniques and resources. Justice served and lessons learned. The legal proceedings had unfolded with the methodical thoroughness that characterizes British justice confronting sophisticated criminal activity. Eleanor's confession, delivered in the presence of multiple witnesses, had provided prosecutors with evidence so comprehensive that any defense based on temporary insanity became untenable. The systematic nature of her campaign, years of preparation, technical deception, surveillance, and the calculated murder of Lionel Greeley painted a portrait of criminal intent that admitted no charitable interpretation. Inspector Slack, whose initial dismissal of the village's concerns had given way to genuine respect for community observation, reported that Eleanor faced charges ranging from insurance fraud to first-degree murder. The sophistication was remarkable, he admitted with professional interest, but sophistication creates complexity, and complexity leaves traces. Miss Marple taught us that the most careful criminals often overlook the human details that ultimately expose them. The insurance fraud alone would have ensured substantial prison time, but combined with Greeley's murder and the systematic stalking of Mrs. Clement, Eleanor faced the prospect of spending her remaining years contemplating the ultimate futility of revenge. The irony was profound. She who had sought to imprison Mrs. Clement in memories of past trauma had succeeded only in imprisoning herself within the consequences of her own choices. Individual healing and community strength. Mrs. Clement's transformation had been the most remarkable aspect of the entire affair. Speaking publicly about her experiences had provided a liberation she had never dared imagine possible, and her decision to remain in St. Mary Mead demonstrated the healing power of community acceptance and support. "This is where I found my voice again," she explained to Miss Marple during one of their regular conversations. "This is where people listened when I finally found the courage to speak the truth." The vicarage parlor, once carefully arranged to avoid reflective surfaces, now displayed mirrors openly, not as instruments of vanity, but as symbols of a woman who had learned to face her own reflection without fear. Mrs. Morrison had discovered confidence in her own perceptions, understanding that sometimes the most innocent eyes could see the deepest truths. Her testimony about the mirror's anomalous behavior had been vindicated completely, teaching the village that careful observation deserved respect regardless of the observer's social standing or perceived expertise. Even Mrs. Price Ridley, whose dramatic pronouncements about supernatural influences had proved wide of the mark, had gained a more nuanced understanding of the difference between genuine mystery and deliberate deception. Her extensive collection of spiritualist literature now included serious works on psychological manipulation, though she maintained her appreciation for properly labeled entertainment. Greenvale Manor's transformation. The empty manor house had been transformed from a symbol of sophisticated evil into an opportunity for community healing. Eleanor's criminal conviction resulted in a set forfeiture, and Mrs. Clement, as the primary victim, found herself entitled to substantial compensation. Her decision to donate the property to the church for conversion into a retreat center for survivors of domestic abuse represented both personal healing and community service. The long gallery where the mirror had held such sinister prominence was being redesigned as a library and meeting space, its tall windows and excellent natural light serving purposes of healing rather than harm. Ezra Pike, whose honest craftsmanship had helped expose Eleanor's deception, volunteered his services for the renovation, ensuring that every modification would serve transparency and openness rather than concealment and manipulation. The village's deeper understanding. The events had provided St. Mary Mead with an education in human psychology that few communities receive so dramatically. The ordinary residents had learned that evil could wear elegant masks and employ sophisticated methods, but also that their collective commitment to truth and mutual support could overcome even the most carefully constructed deceptions. Mrs. Bantry's drawing room, which had served as the stage for Eleanor's final exposure, now regularly hosted informal gatherings designed to ensure that no resident need face difficulties alone. The community had discovered that their greatest strength lay not in individual brilliance, but in their willingness to listen, observe, and support one another through both ordinary challenges and extraordinary crises. Miss Marple's reflections on human nature. As autumn deepened and the village settled into its winter rhythm, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the curious way that mirrors could serve as both weapons and revelations. Eleanor Vance had possessed technical sophistication, financial resources, and years to perfect her revenge, but she had been defeated by something far more powerful: the determination of decent people to see clearly, speak honestly, and stand together against those who would weaponize human psychology. "People often ask me how I solve these puzzles," she confided to Mrs. Bantry as they sat in the peaceful drawing room where so much drama had unfolded. "The truth is, I rarely solve anything. I simply pay attention to what people show me about themselves, particularly when they think no one is watching." Eleanor showed us her true nature through the very sophistication of her cruelty. No innocent person invests such time and resources in psychological warfare. The mirror that had started it all was gone, reduced to fragments and ash in the quarry, but its final reflection had been the clearest of all. It had shown not the distorted images of trauma and manipulation that Eleanor intended, but the true face of a community that refused to let sophisticated evil triumph over simple goodness. The season's gentle conclusion. As the church bells chimed the evening hour and the first frost touched the cottage gardens, St. Mary Mead prepared for winter with the quiet confidence of a community that had faced genuine darkness and emerged stronger for the experience. Mrs. Clement would spend her first Christmas as a truly free woman among friends who had proven their loyalty through the most challenging circumstances. The vicarage would host the traditional Christmas Eve gathering, its mirrors reflecting not memories of trauma, but images of community, healing, and hope. The ordinary concerns of village life, harvest festivals, Christmas pageants, the ongoing maintenance of church and community, had resumed their proper importance, enriched by deeper understanding of human nature's capacity for both cruelty and compassion. Miss Marple, settling into her favorite chair as evening light faded through her cottage windows, reflected on the enduring truth that had emerged from their ordeal. Eleanor Vance's elaborate revenge had been years in the making, requiring extensive resources and sophisticated planning, but it had been defeated by something far simpler and infinitely more powerful: the willingness of ordinary people to look honestly at what was before them and speak truthfully about what they saw. The mirror had finally stopped reflecting lies and begun showing truth, the truth that justice, community, and compassion would ultimately prevail over even the most elegantly constructed campaigns of revenge. In the gentle gathering dusk of a peaceful village evening, that reflection seemed more beautiful and more lasting than any antique glass could ever hope to be. As she took up her knitting once more, Miss Marple smiled at the familiar rhythm of needles and wool, the simple, honest work of creation that stood in such pleasant contrast to the complex machinery of destruction they had so recently dismantled. Tomorrow would bring its own small mysteries and quiet satisfactions, but tonight, St. Mary Mead rested in the knowledge that when tested, they had proven themselves capable of both seeing clearly and acting courageously in defense of truth and justice. The mirror that wouldn't stop reflecting had finally found peace, and with it, so had they all. Snow fell gently over St. Mary Mead as winter settled into the village with the particular peace that comes after storms have passed and communities have discovered their own strength. The white blanket softened the harsh edges of recent memory while allowing the deeper truths to remain clearly visible beneath. Miss Marple, observing the transformation from her cottage window as she arranged late winter roses in a crystal vase, reflected on how nature itself seemed to understand the need for both covering and revealing, for healing that honored rather than erased the lessons learned through trial. The final legal resolution. Eleanor Vance's trial had concluded with the methodical precision that characterizes British justice confronting sophisticated criminal enterprise. The evidence presented had been so comprehensive and damning that even the most skilled defense could find no purchase for arguments of temporary insanity or understandable grief. Judge Pemberton's sentencing reflected both the severity of the crimes and the court's recognition of their psychological sophistication. The defendant has employed considerable intelligence and resources in a campaign of deliberate psychological torture spanning several years, he observed with judicial gravity. The systematic nature of this cruelty, culminating in premeditated murder to conceal her crimes, represents a fundamental rejection of civilized values that demands our severest response. Eleanor Vance would spend her remaining years contemplating the ultimate futility of revenge from within prison walls, her elegant facade finally stripped away to reveal the bitter, damaged woman beneath. The irony was profound. She who had sought to imprison Mrs. Clement within memories of past trauma had succeeded only in creating her own permanent confinement within the consequences of choices made in service of hatred rather than healing. Greenvale Manor's transformation. The manor house itself had undergone a metamorphosis that particularly pleased Miss Marple's sense of poetic justice. Mrs. Clement's decision to establish a foundation for survivors of domestic abuse, funded by Eleanor's forfeited assets, had transformed the site of psychological warfare into a beacon of genuine healing. The long gallery where the sinister mirror had once held court was being converted into a library and meeting space, its tall windows now admitting honest light for honest purposes. Ezra Pike, whose craftsman's integrity had helped expose Eleanor's deception, supervised the renovation with particular care. Every modification serves transparency now, he explained to Miss Marple during one of her visits to observe the progress. No hidden compartments, no secret channels, just good, honest construction designed to last and serve those who need sanctuary. It was during this renovation that Pike made his most poignant discovery. Hidden in the cornice, where years of dust and neglect had concealed it, he found a small envelope addressed to Edmund Vale in a young woman's hopeful handwriting. The letter inside, never opened, contained an 18-year-old Eleanor Vance's photograph and a plea for reconciliation after some forgotten quarrel, closing with the innocent words, "I will be there at 3, and you will see me as I am." When Miss Marple presented this artifact to Mrs. Clement, the widow examined it with steady hands before making a decision that spoke volumes about her character. "Let us let her be 18 somewhere," she said quietly. "That, too, is a kind of mercy." The letter was consigned to the fire, allowing Eleanor Vance's younger, hopeful self to remain untainted by the bitter woman she had become. Individual transformations. Mrs. Clement's evolution from victim to survivor to advocate had been the most remarkable transformation of all. Her foundation's work extended far beyond St. Mary Mead, creating networks of support that helped others recognize and escape situations that might otherwise destroy them. The vicarage parlor, once carefully arranged to avoid mirrors, now displayed reflective surfaces openly, symbols of a woman who had learned to face herself without fear. Mrs. Morrison had discovered confidence in her own perceptions that extended far beyond the immediate mystery. Her testimony about the mirror's anomalous behavior had been vindicated so completely that she now served as an informal teacher, helping others develop the careful observation skills that had proved so crucial The simple oak-framed mirror she and her husband had purchased hung honestly in their hallway, reflecting only what was actually there. Even Inspector Slack had gained valuable wisdom from the experience. His initial dismissal of village concerns had given way to genuine respect for community observation and understanding that sophisticated criminals often employed methods requiring equally sophisticated responses. Miss Marple taught me that the most careful criminals often overlook the human details that ultimately expose them. He admitted during a visit to return Edmund's recovered journals as closed evidence. Community healing and seasonal wisdom. Christmas had come and gone with particular warmth, the traditional celebrations enriched by deeper appreciation for the bonds that held the community together. Mrs. Clement's first Christmas as a truly free woman had been spent among friends who had proven their loyalty through the most challenging circumstances. The Foundation's first holiday gathering had brought together survivors from across the county, creating new networks of understanding and support. As winter deepened into spring's promise, St. Mary Mead prepared for renewal with the quiet confidence of a community that had faced genuine darkness and emerged stronger. The ordinary concerns of village life, church maintenance, seasonal festivals, the gentle gossip that oils rural society's machinery, had resumed their proper importance, enriched by deeper understanding of human nature's capacity for both cruelty and compassion. Miss Marple's enduring reflections. On a bright morning after the last frost, Miss Marple paused at her mantel to straighten the small oval-looking glass that had belonged to her mother. It showed her as she was, cheeks perhaps a little thinner, eyes as sharp as ever, a stray thread clinging to her cuff from her morning's knitting. The simple honesty of the reflection pleased her. "Mirrors," she observed aloud to her empty sitting room, a habit of solitary people who consider conversation civilizing even when conducted alone, are not to be blamed. They only hold what stands before them and release it again. It is we who decide what to bring. Eleanor Vance's elaborate revenge had required years of planning and considerable resources, but it had been defeated by something far simpler and infinitely more powerful. The determination of decent people to see clearly, speak honestly, and stand together against those who would weaponize human psychology for cruel purposes. The mirror that had started it all existed now only in memory and fragments, but its final reflection had been the clearest of all. The true face of a community that refused to let elegant evil triumph over simple goodness. The village's gentle conclusion. As the church bells chimed the morning hour and the first daffodils pushed through the soil in cottage gardens, St. Mary Mead settled into its renewed rhythm with the particular satisfaction that comes from trials successfully weathered. The Foundation's work continued to expand, its influence reaching far beyond village boundaries to help others who struggled with shadows from their past. Miss Marple, taking up her knitting as morning light streamed through her windows, smiled at the familiar rhythm of creation that stood in such pleasant contrast to the complex machinery of destruction they had successfully dismantled. Tomorrow would bring its own small mysteries and quiet satisfactions, but today, St. Mary Mead rested in the knowledge that when tested, they had proven themselves capable of seeing clearly and acting courageously in defense of truth and justice. The mirror that wouldn't stop reflecting had finally found peace, and with it, the entire village had discovered a deeper understanding of both human frailty and human strength that would serve them well in whatever challenges the future might bring. In the end, the most important reflections were not those captured in silvered glass, but those found in the honest faces of friends and neighbors who had chosen to stand together against darkness and emerged victorious through the simple but profound power of community, courage, and truth. As she settled into her morning's work, Miss Marple reflected that they had all learned something valuable from their encounter with sophisticated evil, that while human beings were capable of remarkable cruelty when driven by unhealed wounds and bitter revenge, they were equally capable of extraordinary resilience, compassion, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The shadows cast by Eleanor's mirror had lifted completely, replaced by the clear, honest light of truth that would continue to illuminate St. Mary Mead's peaceful days for years to come.